In preparation for our discussions of microevolution and macroevolution, we need to understand the basic principles of animal development. We need to consider what differences asexual and sexual reproduction actually make in different organisms. You are probably aware that some organisms can reproduce asexually and some sexually, and some actually can choose asexual or sexual reproduction based on their current needs. Keeping in mind, with asexual and sexual reproduction, there are basic outcomes that we should expect. From asexual reproduction, we're looking at the creation of a genetically identical offspring. This is important because what we are actually producing then is a clone of the parent, right? So in this generation of a perfectly identical offspring, in this case with our hydra, this hydra has produced a bud of itself, which is a genetic copy and will eventually fall off and become a new hydra, but it is perfectly identical to the original parent hydra. In some conditions, this is perfectly acceptable, as long as the environmental conditions don't change. We'll discuss why this is important in the future, but in brief, if every organism of a particular species in an environment is exactly identical, you need to think about what it means if the environment changes. So if the environment changes for that organism, and they're all perfectly identical, if disease would come in and affect one, it affects them all. If food conditions change and it affects one, it affects them all. There's very little variability in these organisms. Now, this is not always bad. Asexual reproduction is actually very, very quick, so we can look at a much faster generation time and turnover of organisms. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, requires fertilization of an egg by a sperm or of an egg-like mechanism fertilized by a sperm or spore-like mechanism. So in the process of producing a gamete, or in this case, choosing two gametes that will form a diploid zygote, 2N. Remember, 2N refers to chromosome copy. So this means that you have two copies of each chromosome. (2N) for humans equals 46, meaning you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We'll discuss this more in genetics. For normal sexual reproduction, we look at a sperm produced by the male and an egg produced by the female. Note here that the egg is typically much larger. This is because the egg contains all of the cytoplasm and organelles needed to produce a new zygote. Remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. The sperm we have labeled here as being relatively small. This is not to be offensive to the males in any way. It's just that the sperm is contributing genetic material and little else. Now, that genetic material is very important because it's an entire copy of DNA that's going to contribute to that 2N we just previously discussed. So we're getting 1N from the sperm, 1N from the egg. So 1N plus 1N equals 2N. This is chromosome copy number, remember. So we're getting one set of chromosomes from mom, one set of chromosomes from dad and producing a zygote with 2N. These organisms that I mentioned that reproduce both sexually and asexually, such as the sea anemones here, have options. If conditions are right and the population and individuals are doing well, they may choose to produce offspring, in this case by fission. Okay, so when we look at this production, very different than if the sea anemone would simply produce eggs and then be dependent on the addition of sperm to those eggs to produce the zygote. When might an organism choose to produce eggs instead of reproducing asexually? Sexual reproduction is usually in response to changes in the environment, stress on the organisms, or a detected need for an increase in genetic variability. Remember, sexual reproduction's main goal is to increase genetic variability for organisms. Other options. Organisms can be hermaphrodites, meaning that they contain both female and male components, meaning they can produce both eggs and sperm, or the species eggs and sperm, or the species equivalent of that. We can also look at this as being a strong advantage in some environments, particularly for organisms that are few in number or are not living in social type scenarios, meaning that you may rarely see another individual of your same species. If this is the case, then it's very difficult to mate, right, and reproduce sexually. So, when they do find a mate, it's best for the population if they can actually exchange gametes with the other individuals. So they're actually going to exchange both eggs and sperm with the other, in this case, earthworm. So earthworm number 1 is going to give eggs and sperm to earthworm number 2 and vice versa. Okay? So this means that they have actually exchanged full complements of genetic material and will produce offspring that are a combination of both earthworms. In sexual reproduction, we can also look at whether or not external or internal fertilization occurs. This is species dependent. For you, we look at internal fertilization, and we see this with most mammals and many other organisms as well in the animal kingdom. External fertilization, you see here I have labeled for mostly fish and amphibian species, so frogs and so on. We see eggs will be deposited and then sperm will be spread over the top of this. This typically allows for a greater number of eggs produced, for us, and for that organism may increase the chances of offspring actually being produced. When we look at internal fertilization, of course humans are not producing the same number of eggs at a time as frogs. Frogs, we can see upwards of 1,000+ eggs produced at a time. Humans, 1 per cycle. Typically, we'll get into twins and so on later. But if we're looking at 1 offspring per event or reproductive event versus potentially thousands, we need to think about the stress on mom, right? Imagine a human mom trying to carry 1,000 offspring at a time. So with the production of eggs laid externally by the female, then the male will produce sperm over top of the eggs. The sperm and eggs will actually unite in the environment, and some of those eggs will fertilize, not all, but some. And those fertilized eggs will hopefully grow into tadpoles and then eventually into frogs. Notice the very high copy number of eggs. They're kind of all over the place here, right? So there may be thousands of eggs in this pile. From the standpoint, this is important, high predation rates on the eggs. And you may say, okay, well, if there's going to be high predation on the eggs, why doesn't mom just carry the eggs? We'll get into this more in evolution, why this is a stronger reproduction mechanism for the frogs and many fish, and lots of the amphibians.